Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to those of you who've joined us here in Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us online. I'm Amelia Parnell, NASPA's Vice President for Research and Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the formal release of the report, State Legislative Development on Campus Sexual Violence, Issues in the Context of Safety. This report reflects a really strong partnership between NASPA and Education Commission of the States, one that we're very proud of because it reflects the importance of connecting policy and practice as we tackle this critical issue on college campuses. We have a very full program for you today, and we invite you to join the conversation by posting comments and leaving questions for our moderated panel discussion on Twitter using the hashtag NASPAECS2016. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Morse, NASPA's Director for Policy, Research, and Advocacy, and he'll start the conversation by presenting the major themes from this report. Thanks, Andrew.
Good morning to everyone joining us in our audience today, as well as our online universe. Very pleased to be here to talk about the important issue of addressing and preventing campus sexual violence. This partnership that we are hosting with Education Commission of the States really flowed from several key themes undergirding the recent deliberations and conversation nationally about preventing and addressing sexual violence. And in recent years, campus approaches to prevent and address sexual violence have come under increased public scrutiny. Two recent national surveys from the Association of American Universities and Washington Post and the Kaiser Family Foundation helped to frame the incidence rates of unwanted sexual behavior upon entry into an institution of higher education. That has added to a fueled discussion about campus efforts and the problem of sexual violence overall in our country. Of course, public interest is met by a backdrop of existing federal law and regulation that have provided the contours of campus strategies to create and sustain safe, inclusive, and equitable living and learning environments. And amidst this backdrop of law and institutional strategy have been policy proposals across the states that seek to bring change to campus approaches to prevent and address sexual violence. It is out of this deliberation, the existing campus strategies, and the backdrop of law and regulation that a thought partnership with Education Commission of the States and NASPA was formed. We, in particular, started to explore several sort of top-level questions that have framed our efforts to study and consider these developments in context. Does policy impede established and effective campus practices and processes? Recognizing that achieving fair process is a complex and difficult task, will proposed policy actions create negative consequences that impede equitable adjudication processes and safe, inclusive educational environments? And lastly, does policy interfere with superseding law, federal law particularly? So we formed a strategic partnership to examine recent legislative activity across the states, looking at the policy architecture of the legislative proposals, the final action on those proposals and where they occurred, and sought to determine whether there were key themes and issues emerging across the states. So how we achieved that task is we took a content analysis. I'm pleased to be joined by partners here, Dr. Brian Sponsler, Lauren Cisneros in the room, but also we have support from, and I'd like to thank Mary Fulton from Education Commission of the States, Zeke Perez, also at ECS, and a number of partners at NASPA and Education Commission of the States who provided good groundwork for this partnership. We conducted a content analysis of state-level policy developments on sexual assault. We broke down the policy themes by area, and we reported those themes in our launch of the report. Our content analysis yielded 4 overarching themes: defining affirmative consent, so states have pushed to establish a common definition of consent for sexual activity that pertains only to institutions. Transcript notation. State policy has addressed notation of serious violations of a campus code of conduct, including sexual assault, on student transcripts. The role of local law enforcement is another theme. State policy has sought to define, clarify, or expand the role of local law enforcement in campus reporting and investigative processes following an incident of sexual violence. And finally, the role of legal counsel. State policy has addressed the role of legal counsel in the campus adjudication process by defining, refining, or expanding the relationship that local law enforcement have with our colleges and universities. These 4 themes were then dug into against the backdrop of effective policy or effective practice and overarching federal law and regulation or existing state level policy. We framed issues and considerations for leaders in higher education and state policy. Now, the importance of that, the connection there, is that in order for policy to achieve its merits and its intent, it's important that those who work on the ground every day, working to support the safety and well-being of our campus communities, have a voice in the policy deliberations across the states. So we saw this opportunity to partner as one in which we can bring those voices together in informed, deliberative conversation. So our analysis of 2013 to 2015 legislative activity saw 23 separate states that took action on at least one of the 4 themes. So there are states that took action on more than one of those themes. Out of those 23 separate states, 8 states enacted a law on at least one of those 4 themes. So today, in framing our discussion, I'm going to be presenting each of those themes, looking at some of the policy architecture across those 4 themes, and just bringing some, not all, of the considerations that leaders in higher education and state policy may want to consider as these policy proposals continue to be deliberated across the states. So, looking first at defining affirmative consent. Since 2014, 4 states, California, Hawaii, Illinois, and New York, have enacted legislation that addresses or defines affirmative consent related to sexual activity between students enrolled in a post-secondary institution. Some of the common policy architecture that we observed in our analysis of state legislative activity found, for instance, that California, Illinois, and New York's definitions share the common element that consent is voluntarily and freely given. Statutes further articulate that lack of resistance does not indicate consent, and New York's law also specifies that when consent is withdrawn or can no longer be given, sexual activity must stop. California, Illinois, and New York's laws articulate 3 common circumstances in which a person cannot consent. In particular, if the person is under the influence of alcohol or drugs, has a mental disability, or is asleep or unconscious. And further, California's law requires the preponderance of evidence standard to be used to examine elements of the complaint against the accused. It's the first time state policy has articulated the standard used to be used in the conduct process. Some of the issues and considerations for leaders in higher education and state policy that emerge in looking at these proposals. Affirmative consent definitions may not be aligned with definitions articulated in the state criminal court system. Ensuring that students are aware of these distinctions and the implications of them in the campus conduct process or criminal court system is important to trauma-informed practice. If we know that the different definitions, a preponderant standard is one example used in the campus definition, and a criminal definition, beyond reasonable doubt definition in the state system, it's important in articulating what those mean for our students and how that might inform the choices that they make following an incident or report of sexual violence. Through statutory definition of consent, though the definition of consent now exists in several states, long-standing complexities in determining responsibility remains. Initial disclosure and reporting may occur months after the incident, and alcohol and other drugs might be involved. Those are issues that our practitioners are dealing with and navigating every day as we look to support and affirm safe, well-being, and inclusive educational environments. Now to the role of local law enforcement. And broadly, we saw that the activity across the states was, it varied quite a bit, looking at defining, refining, and expanding the role of local law enforcement in the campus conduct process on sexual violence. So since 2014, 4 states, California, Minnesota, New York, and Virginia, have enacted legislation that expands, creates boundaries with or modifies the relationship with local law enforcement jurisdictions. On one element of the policy architecture we noticed, some states articulate the rights of survivors to choose reporting as one option. Minnesota and New York, for instance, require institutions to allow survivors to decide whether to refer a case to local law enforcement, putting the decision in the survivor's hands. Further, Minnesota codifies the law enforcement interest to allow the survivor to choose whether to report. That is one example, a recent example, where the local law enforcement's interests and role also affirms the right for the survivor to choose. California, another element of the policy conversation is that states authorize requirements for reporting to local law enforcement. So the California legislation requires post-secondary institutions to adopt policies to report violent crimes, sexual assaults, or hate crimes to local law enforcement immediately or as soon as reasonably possible. And a third element is that some states enacted the modification of MOUs between post-secondary institutions and local law enforcement authorities. Virginia, for example, requires institutions to amend agreements between institutions and local police jurisdictions to notify the local attorney for the Commonwealth within 48 hours or beginning an investigation that involved a felony criminal investigation, codifying the time at which a report must be forwarded to local law enforcement. Now, when we looked at this element in particular, we noticed some potential conflicts with superseding federal law, the Clery Act in particular. 34 CFR 668.46, to be as specific as I possibly can, requires institutions to allow survivors the right to refuse a report to local law enforcement, thereby raising the important question that if following state statute, an institution would be then violating federal statute, putting them in an untenable regulatory position. MOUs must account also for the overlapping jurisdictions of local law enforcement that are present within many campus communities. It's not a one-to-one relationship across all institutions in all jurisdictions in all states, that there's only one local law enforcement authority that serves the campus community. Finally, supporting and affirming the rights of survivors to choose their path to support and or resolve an incident is critical to compliance with federal law. Seek to raise the important point that the spirit of Title IX is to ensure safe, equitable access for all students enrolled in higher education. A third element, transcript notation, noted that in two states, New York and Virginia, laws were enacted that required post-secondary institutions to make a notation of conduct violation on student transcripts. In their definitions, institutions in New York and Virginia must indicate whether a student has been suspended or expelled for a violation of an institution's code of conduct, including sexual violence on the transcript. Both states require institutions to note whether a student withdrew prior to the conclusion of a conduct adjudication process. Both states also allow circumstances in which notations must be removed if a student's responsibility is vacated or after the suspension has been served. Now, in California, we noted that a bill that would require transcript notation passed both houses, but Governor Jerry Brown ultimately vetoed that legislation, and I'll get to that in just a second. As we considered the issues and considerations that would require the attention and leadership of leaders in state policy in higher education, we raised the question about whether definitions for and types of violations that lead to suspension or expulsion vary across institutions. Not being clear about the nature of the violation could create unintended consequences for students who do not commit acts of sexual violence or other serious offenses. Students should also be informed about the process to have notation vacated, particularly if they must leave the institution prior to the outcome of the conduct process for reasons other than not wanting to follow through on their adjudication process. Institutions may also be concerned about violating FERPA. Here is where I want to raise the veto by Governor Brown. In his veto message, Governor Brown noted that institutions already have policy architecture that allows for the notation of conduct violations to be noted on the transcript. and also so I can further be as specific as possible, FERPA CFR 9931 A1 and 2 provide latitude for institutional disclosure of students' information on or in supplement to an education record that is sent to another post-secondary institution. FERPA provides latitude for institutions to choose to do that if they would like. On to legal counsel. From 2013 to 2015, the role of legal counsel in campus conduct proceedings has been deliberated by elected leaders in 5 states: North Carolina, North Dakota, South Carolina, Massachusetts, and Arkansas. Arkansas, North Carolina, and North Dakota enacted laws expanding the role of legal counsel in conduct proceedings. Some common architecture in those laws is that the role of the counsel is, including attorneys, allows for what is defined in statute as full participation on behalf of an individual who has had an allegation of sexual violence against them in the campus conduct process. In some of the states, student organizations are also allowed to have counsel represent them in the conduct process. But in some states, certain latitude is provided for legal counsel to not fully represent students for violations of academic dishonesty or the honor code. Some of the issues that we found when we examined the legislation closely was, to date, the operational definitions of what constitute full participation or representation are unclear. But also, April 2014 guidance by the United States Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, articulates that all parties involved in campus conduct proceedings can have access to an advisor of their choice at all phases of the process. The architecture of having someone represent you in the campus conduct process is already articulated in federal regulation. However, the same guidance noted that institutions define the boundaries of the advisor's involvement, and these boundaries must apply equally to advisors of all other parties involved. So it's a matter of establishing equal representation and equal participation by the advisor, and the institution has the opportunity to define what that looks like. There's a reason why, I believe, why the institution has been given that latitude. And part of it is expanding the role of counsel in law does not guarantee that all students involved in an adjudication process will actually have access to an attorney, creating potential inequities in the campus conduct process, whereby an individual, a survivor who alleges sexual violence, may have access to an attorney and the accused may not, or vice versa, thereby leading to the very real prospect that there will be unequal representation as articulated by federal law that the institution must comply with. So, some closing thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, in prompting the necessity and importance of this partnership, we saw value and importance of bringing together leaders in higher education and state policy together to talk about what these policy deliberations mean in practice and whether they will be able to truly deliver on their intent or their spirit. And as these policy deliberations unfold, it's important, it's imperative for these partners to continue having these important conversations and come together on consensus about appropriate, responsible ways to enact law and regulation and support practice that enables institutional leaders to create and maintain the safe, equitable, and inclusive campus environments that we all desire. Now, in part of this conversation today, we wanted to bring together leaders who are really engaging in sexual violence prevention and practice work across the country. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you panelists for today's discussion who are going to be really digging into issues of practice, issues of policy, and what's going on across the country. So if I could have Dr. Will Del Pilar from the Office of Higher and Post-Secondary Education for the Pennsylvania Department of Education join us, Kevin Kruger, NASPA President, and Dr. Felicia McGinty, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. And I will turn the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Brian Sponsler from Education Commission of the States.
Andrew, thank you very much. And thanks to the panelists to join us, and those of you that are here in attendance and joining us online. We really appreciate coming together to talk about an issue that's really important to the two organizations that are partnering on this work. But I just want to take a moment and also share how important this particular topic is to me, but also what this partnership represents. I've spent the majority of my professional career thinking about the ways in which we can bring together student affairs professionals with the public policy making community, how we can take the lessons that are learned on our campuses and from the professionals and students that work every day in an environment of implementation and roll those lessons up to policy. And so just as a personal aside, I really appreciate the space that Kevin and Jeremy Anderson, who's with us here today as well, the President of Education Commission of the States, have given to exploring this partnership, and really, really appreciate it. I think Andrew touched on a number of different elements of the policy conversation. I want to back up one level and just say that I think when we look across the landscape of higher education policy issues that we're facing at the moment, campus sexual violence policy is certainly one that's received a whole lot of attention at the federal, state, and institutional level. But I think it also is an issue that represents something that's kind of unique in our policymaking conversations. And that is what I think is some broad agreement about the first principle reason that we're engaged in this work, which is how can we best design inclusive and safe communities for our students to learn. I don't think there's disagreement on the goal of what we're trying to do. I think where we've continued to have questions is about process. So what's the best way to do that? Which level of authority do we think we should execute some of these policies that we're considering? Are these practices we want to leave to the institution level? Is there a role for states as we're exploring today? And then certainly what's the role of the federal government both moving forward and in looking at the history of regulation and legislation that touches on these topics? I do want to underscore that as we talk about policy and we kind of can get into an academic and conceptual exercise here, that we need to keep in mind the students of this particular piece of work, right? And so anybody who has personally been touched by this issue or has had a family member or a friend touched by this issue or has been part of a community where we've seen how it can really rip at the fabric of what we're trying to build on campus knows how important it is to do this work. We have to get this right because campus sexual violence and sexual violence in general is something that we don't have any room for in the society we're trying to build. So I think as we talk about different options and we can get somewhat technical, I do want to make sure that for me personally, and I know for Education Commission of States and my colleagues at NASPA, this is an issue that needs to be driven by what we're trying to do to help individuals. And I think trying to help individuals and campuses deal with this issue is what I want to talk about with our three experts on the panel here a little bit today. So we'll have an opportunity to have a conversation that I'll sort of guide for the next 20 to 25 minutes. And then we've got certainly places that we can have conversations and questions with those of you that are here in person. And we also have the ability for me to take questions that are coming in virtually from our webinar audience. So I want to start us off by just turning to you, Kevin, and just ask a little bit. We've been working on this issue a long time together. You've been working on this issue personally and your role with NASPA for a long time. Andrew described the landscape at the state level. We've done a lot of stuff here at the federal level as well. As you've talked about this issue, sort of where do you see us? We sort of level set where you see we kind of are right now as a place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And before I dig in, let me just echo our appreciation for the work that Andrew and you and your staffs have done on this. It's outstanding. I think it adds a richness to the conversation about where we're heading and nationally, both at the federal and state level and the campus level. So thank you for that. And also just, Brian, your comment about we not getting so wonkish about this that we lose sight of the fact that we're really dealing with the human lives of our students. Brian, when he worked with NASPA for about 2 minutes back a few years ago, I'm kidding, was part of the staff, some representatives we had to the negotiated rulemaking for VAWA, and I see Allison back there. Allison was there as well, and every time you came back from that session, you were visibly moved by the conversation because it's about policy, but it's also about the lives of our students, and I kind of want to just echo that because I think that does get lost sometimes as we get argumentative. And I think one of the things that's been difficult about this issue, and so where we are is, it often is contentious. It's contentious between us and the states. It's contentious between us and the Office of Civil Rights. It's contentious about us and the media. And I think while we can understand that because it's such an emotional issue, and there's so many stakeholders at the table for this issue, I think it's also, again, very important that we get back to how this affects our students. So what I've seen, and I'm on the road a lot, like many of us are, and I'm with campuses a lot. And what I would say where we are is that there has been an enormous amount of activity in the last 4 years, and some justifiably would say, well, why wasn't that activity taking place before all this was raised? And while there was a lot going on campus, I think that the Dear Colleague letter and some of the victims advocate groups have sort of shaken higher education in some ways that really probably was necessary. There has been a lot of, codes rewritten and policies rewritten and conduct processes revised. Probably the biggest thing we've seen is an enormous amount of resources pumped into this issue. In a time when there's not a lot of new hiring taking place on any campus, in fact, there's more contraction actually of staffing. We've seen Title IX officers, sexual assault investigators, victims advocates. We've seen a lot of resources put into staffing, which I think is helping at a variety of different levels on campus. At the same time also, and Felicia may comment on this when she talks, there's also been a lot of money thrown at this without a lot of evidence about what works. And I hate to use the spaghetti on the wall metaphor, but sometimes that's the right one. I think there's been a pressure to do as much as we possibly can without stopping and saying what works, what's effective, where's the research, where's the evidence. So I think that's a little bit of where we are right now. I think we're still some sorting out, particularly on the educational and prevention side, less about the adjudication side. There's also been an enormous infusion of vendors in this space. I think that's another complication to this. Some really good work, and then a lot of folks who maybe perhaps have a more predatory view of taking advantage of the public view of this without really thinking about syncing up evidence and effectiveness to the work that they're doing. Some of you have heard, and I've written about this, and I just want to repeat that one of my frustrations in terms of where we are still today is I wish we were in a better place to think about this complex problem in a collaborative way as partners with the multiple stakeholders who are in this issue. And I wish we weren't finger pointing and blaming as much as what I see. I see that certainly from the media. I also see it from our folks sometimes in the public policy space. And what I find to be challenging is the ongoing narrative that you see both at the federal, state, and at the local level, that colleges would much rather hide sexual assaults than they would to deal with the issue. And while we can certainly find examples of that, and we certainly see that in high-profile cases, sometimes involving sports, NCAA programs or other high-profile cases. On balance, this is my bias about this, the people that are working in this area are deeply committed to this issue. Student affairs professionals get into this work because they care about the individual student. And so as I travel around the country, one of the things that the biggest frustrations I hear are people who are really doing good work on very complex issues and feel like they're accused of something that feels sort of dirty and not very positive for students. And I wish we could work more collaboratively. And I would say as we dig into the state issue, I would hope that we wish that we would have more collaborative conversations with our states and our state policymakers as opposed to sort of having things really top down. So last thing I just want to, I think let me just say one last thing and then we can move on. I think one of the other places we are is that this issue overlays where higher education is going. And where higher education is becoming enormously diverse and complex. So what often happens is we think about solutions for something like sexual violence. We think about it in terms of residential colleges, people living in a single building, going to a classroom, sitting in that classroom, going home. That environment, and that is still a big part of the college experience, but one of the challenges we have is that the collegiate experience and the student experience is so varied now. Community colleges. What works for a 4-year residential college doesn't work with the community colleges. the explosion of online learning so is creating challenges for us. Where our students are, the fact that they may be taking classes at one university that's registered in one state, but they may be actually living in another state. The blurring of the lines and the hybridization of higher education, I think, make single solutions, perhaps that come through policy, a little challenging because there's so much diversity in the way that we learn. International students, I mean, you can go on and on. So I want to raise that because I think sometimes we lose the nuance of the fact that we're not only talking about your classic residential college as we think about how all this is applied. So I think I'm encouraged by where we are. I've seen enormous progress, lots to be done. I'm looking at my colleague Ellie, founder of Cultural Respect at NASPA, and the work that she's doing with 12 pilot institutions trying to really develop comprehensive approaches to this. Some really good work, the work that the Cleary Center is doing, some really fantastic efforts out there in prevention, and so looking forward to a rich conversation about where we're heading now.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin. That's great, and it actually gives me a great opportunity to bring Will into the conversation because I think part of what we were hoping Will could share and talk about is I think Pennsylvania is a state that has taken a pretty deliberative approach to trying to be inclusive and engaging sort of policy audiences with the campus community. So, Will, I was wondering if you could start us off by talking a little bit about the It's On Us campaign that Pennsylvania had recently announced to the governor's office, and particularly the ways in which these strategies have tried to bring together the campus practitioners and their perspective on this with the policy audience.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I think one of the most challenging aspects of this work is to try and achieve the buy-in from all parts of the community, including leadership. When Governor Tom Wolf launched the It's On Us Pennsylvania campaign last month, he was joined by over 50 college presidents, college and university presidents, as well as school district superintendents, who publicly pledged their commitment to being part of the solution to end sexual violence. Too often, leadership and communities think about violence after it has occurred. This campaign really focuses on building from the national It's On Us campaign that was sparked by the White House in 2014, and attempts to reframe the conversation in a few key ways. The It's On Us campaign, It's On Us Pennsylvania campaign, first proactively garners commitment and buy-in from all community members, including presidents, superintendents, faculty, staff, students, family, neighbors, making it clear that everyone can and must play a role in preventing sexual assault. Secondly, it recognizes that sexual violence doesn't begin or end in college. So we include K-12, post-secondary community partners to ensure improved awareness and outcomes. We're promoting inclusive messaging that invites all community members, including men, to learn about the issue surrounding sexual violence and the ways they can challenge cultural norms that promote violence. Fourth, it helps communities think and talk about sexual violence in a way that is more accessible and empowering, breaking down barriers that can prevent individuals from understanding the issue and making a difference. And finally, it focuses on underreporting as a key challenge that leaders at the local and state level must address to ensure that survivors feel comfortable and confident coming forward to access critical services, resources, and care. Our hope is that by engaging leaders and listening to the experiences of students, staff, and community members, we can create conditions at the state level that catalyze change and impact Pennsylvania schools.
And Will, as just a quick follow-up on the process piece of this, can you talk a little bit about how this effort came to be? Because I think one of the things that, through our work at Education Commission of the States, we're always looking for examples of things that people can do to be inclusive on this issue. Just from a process side, how did this initiative come to fruition?
We looked at who was engaged in this in the initiative at a state level, and so we looked at the resources, technical assistance, how we were supporting the campuses. The governor and the governor's office really thought it would be important for us to take a lead on this, and so we began by bringing groups together, and so we brought different stakeholders together, college presidents, community advocates. We brought in student affairs professionals. There were people from the policy side to have conversations. We're conducting a series of roundtables. Our next one is Tuesday at the University of Pittsburgh, and so we'll have 24 people at the table to have this conversation around campus sexual assaults and how do we address it from a policy perspective. Can we address it from a policy perspective? How do we address it at a campus level? What is the role of the state and how can we provide resources or guidance as they continue to tackle this issue? So for us, it was about being inclusive and trying to include all members of the who all members around this issue to have a part at the table and be a part of the conversation. And I'll say, in Pennsylvania, many of the people who were being invited were excited about the opportunity to be a part of this conversation and to be included in the conversation. And so I think in Pennsylvania, as we approach it, we thought, how do we be inclusive? How do we as a state provide resources and guidance and then get input and feedback from the people who are working at this issue at a ground level?
I just wanted to say that that's the model that we needed to enact. I mean, that's a great kind of blueprint for how to do this, because I think it sort of acknowledges that we have a common interest, and we need state partnerships. That's a really key part of this of the answer. And I just want to applaud you for the idea of bringing people together, listening sessions, that kind of thing, so there's a mutual understanding. I think that's how we'll get better policy. So I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, and Alicia, maybe you can jump in here a little bit on the perspective from the campus vantage point, either to the response to the partnership aspect and how you would feel about being included in conversations like that and the role you can play. Would be a great place to start, and then I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about what we are seeing as sort of some strategies that are working on the prevention and response side as well.
Sure. I would say that partnerships such as those that Will outlined are important. And from my perspective, the more people, the more stakeholders that we can engage in these conversations, the better. My worry is that we are in a position where there's a lot of blame and shame, and there's an assumption, as Kevin mentioned earlier, that institutions are hiding the problems or not supporting victims. And so that is not true. But I think the more we can collaborate together and share information, the better we are able to craft legislation that's helpful and not harmful to victims and institutions. And the better we're going to be able to actually address this issue at the root. And what we have found, and I think what you will see at the data from other institutions and other states is, based on what we see with victimization, these issues are happening long before these young people arrive on college campuses. And so the real issue, from my perspective, is a need to have legislation that points to both high school and middle school and start those conversations and that education at that level. Because when students come to us, how do we unlearn 18 years of past behavior and thoughts around consent, sex, relationships? And so that universities and colleges won't be able to solve this problem alone. So I would say, from my perspective, the old adage, it takes a village, is very applicable in this work. We can't continue to point fingers at one another and say, well, if you had a better conduct process, that would fix it. No, that would only deal with the problem that's there. We want to stop this from happening. And so we need to start earlier. We need to involve lots of folks in that conversation. It needs to involve student affairs professionals. It needs to involve victims advocates. It needs to involve the researchers that are doing this work. It needs to involve law enforcement, the community, our government. Everyone needs to be involved in addressing this. And first we have to start with really understanding the problem rather than creating legislation and then trying to back things into it.
Yeah, well, actually, so maybe we could pick up on that a little bit, because one of the things that I know your campus has been involved with is some of the early and really leadership work around trying to get a sense of defining that problem. And through campus
Absolutely.
climate surveys, one of the things that we hear often from state policy folks is, I see the national numbers, I understand sort of in the aggregate where we are, but it's hard for me to figure out how to understand what this looks like on individual institutions, either in my district or in my state. Could you talk a little bit about
Certainly,
that campus climate
certainly.
survey work and the ways that
Absolutely.
can help inform our conversation?
We were asked by the White House to pilot the campus climate survey, and we were honored to do that work because we were planning to do a survey on our own. So having the opportunity was helpful to us. We are in a unique situation where we have a partnership with a group of faculty who do research from our Center on Violence Against Women and Children. And so we were already working with them. They served as the principal investigators for that project. And the beauty of it was that we had a partnership between the research team and the student affairs professionals who were doing the work on the ground, and the victims advocates. And so we were able to approach that survey process holistically. Our goal was to truly know our truth so then we could do something about it. And so before we initiated our campus climate survey, we did a comprehensive resource audit. So we looked at our entire campus, we looked at websites, bulletin boards, what was said in orientation, where different messages were being shared, and gathered all that information to understand what are we telling students about these issues. And after we completed the resource audit, then we did a survey. And we had about a 28% response rate on our survey. And I think what helped us there was we got students excited about it. We shared with them that we were going to be engaging in this process and we wanted to hear their voices. And so they embraced it. What we found is students want to talk about this issue. They are concerned. And so we made them equal partners in that process. So we did a quantitative survey, and then we followed up with focus groups to go in depth with some of the things that we found in that initial survey, ask more questions. We targeted specific groups on campus for those focus groups. So we did a group specifically with athletes. We did a focus group with students of color in their spaces, in those cultural centers. We did a focus group with Greek students, so fraternity and sorority students. We did a focus group specifically with survivors. We did one with graduate students. So we really worked to understand different voices and segments of different populations across the campus. What are their feelings, thoughts, and experiences on this topic? After we did the focus group and gathered all the data from the initial survey, the research team prepared a set of recommendations for our campus community. And we took those recommendations and then created an action plan. Because if you just do a survey, then you have data. But what matters and what will change your campus climate is how you use that data to inform your work. So based on what we learned from that survey, we've made a number of changes. We've implemented some different programs. We've developed a policy. So now we have this comprehensive action plan with metrics that we are able to first of all, be accountable to our students with. So we've gone back to them and said, we ask, and we called our survey the I Speak survey. And so we say, you spoke, we listened. Now here's what we're doing. So they've been a part of this campaign throughout the year.
And is any of that information that's going back to inform sort of institutional practice and student behavior also have an opportunity to get rolled up into sort of state level conversations at all?
Yes.
How's that? Yeah.
So New Jersey is on the list of states that have pending legislation.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, oftentimes legislators sit in a room, come up with an idea, and think that it's all very well intended, but
yeah.
doesn't always comport with federal legislation, isn't congruent with our own code of conduct and so forth. So we were able to work with our legislators to put that on the brakes, and what they did do was legislate a task force, a statewide task force, and on that task force we'll have a person from the research university participate, and so we're going to use what we've learned to help inform our legislators and to help them understand, and so and to invite other institutions, so then as they're starting to maybe look at and consider other legislation, they actually have some facts and they can get a sense of, here's one practice, these are things that we've learned that actually work, and there's some evidence behind it, as opposed to all the emotion that comes with this type of topic.
Yeah, well, I think, and I see Kevin nodding, I think that approach to try to get that type of knowledge and information about what's happening at campus level up is true in other places, and Kevin, I know you've seen that. I want to, all three of you have raised this sort of issue of calendars or timing in some respects. And I think one of the issues that we see here is that the policy-making calendar and the calendar of the politics of sexual violence in our states is one thing that our legislators are responding to, or governor's office have to respond to. That calendar doesn't always line up with an academic calendar, and it also doesn't always allow for the type of slow, deliberative process that's been described about consensus building and partnership building in the short run. I think those are strategies that in the long run we hope provide better public policy and better campus environments for our students. But maybe to Will and Kevin both on this, I mean, this notion of the pace of change and the amount of space for deliberation and consideration of facts and information that we may gather through some of the work that was just described. What are you seeing in terms of our ability to get that information in people's hands at the right time, or the resistance to sort of having a pace slow down a little bit to allow for those types of conversations?
Well, I think that's always a challenge, is getting the information. One, finding the correct information and drawing from resources, especially at a national level. One of the things that we use is we use the ECS NASPA tool and examine the crosswalk. And so we were looking at what other states had done. We're trying to compare that to state and national, to federal and state law, and we're trying to do a comparison. So I think it's always providing the correct tools and ensuring that we have the information, the resources to be able to provide lawmakers. And so it's providing that information in a digestible way in a timely fashion that can be a real challenge from a state perspective. And so who are the people that are influencing the policy? Who are the legislators that are thinking about moving a piece of legislation forward? Who's backing that legislation? So trying to provide them with the correct information requires a lot of different, I think, coordination at a state level. And so, for example, we have an Office of Policy. I work with our Office of Policy to try and make sure that if there are any issues that are being brought up in the education subcommittees at the House or Senate level in Pennsylvania, that we know what legislation is moving, and then how can we provide information, resources, and put them in front of professionals who are doing this work at a state, a campus, at a national level. And so I think it's finding the resources, pulling them together, and sometimes in a very short amount of time to try and address that doesn't always line up, and I would say never, hardly ever lines up with the campus calendar. So I think it's a real challenge, and it's something that we struggle with. We're lucky on our staff. We have some experts on this issue who we're able to go to, and so we can turn around things in a timely fashion. But bringing those different people together, given the timeliness, is sometimes challenging, especially in an election year.
Well, I would just add that I think, thankfully, there has been some urgency to this issue that is pretty unprecedented, actually, in terms of how fast things have changed and moved on the campus. I mean, campus decision-making is glacial often, and the consensus decision model that we use is fantastic, but it makes change very slow sometimes. Yes. In this case, we circumvented some of that consensus glacialness to this issue, which I think has been good. I think the challenge for, I mentioned this in my opening comments, I think the challenge is we can fix systems really quick. We can change policies, we can change training programs for boards and those kinds of things. We can create new offices, but I think the place where we're going to need more time is behavioral science. We need to understand what works, and this is going to take some science and some resources on this to figure this part out, so that when we think about issues on the prevention side in particular, we're putting our money and our efforts in areas that we know work. And that right now there's I think a paucity of really good evidence about what works in a very complex issue. I think the other thing I just wanted to say, that I think that the kind of work that Rutgers and many institutions are doing on the campus climate surveys really needs to be elevated nationally. I think this needs to be a practice that all institutions engage in. That is, that you should be wanting to understand the nature of this issue outside of what's legally required in terms of reporting. And otherwise you have no gauge for the sense of the issue on your campus and whether you're making any progress or not. And I keep saying, so all this effort, all this money we put into this, if you had good data from a campus climate survey today, 4 years from now, we should see something. Yeah. And if we don't see something, campus by campus, then that tells us something about the problem also, and the intractability of the problem, which would be pretty depressing. But I think we have to engage in that, and that's something we've got to do right away. And there's enough good examples out now there of campus climate surveys. I think that's something that should move pretty quickly, and not be in the sort of stuck in the decision-making models of institutions.
Yeah, Will, go ahead.
I wanted to address just quickly. I think that it's a challenge from a state policy perspective to wait for evidence to wait for there to be evidence. Sometimes I think it's hard because in the absence of evidence, should we do nothing?
No.
And so I think that that's where, it's really hard oftentimes to weigh what's best practice, what's effective practice, how do we do something that will impact this now in the absence of evidence. And so I think that's, from a policy perspective, it's a real challenge. An example of that, including this issue, for example, is free community college. We have no evidence if it works, how it will impact everyone involved, but we're moving forward despite there being a lack of evidence on the effectiveness or the potential outcomes of this. And so I think that that's, from a policy perspective, that's a challenge. And so in the absence of evidence, I think sometimes we do want to do something.
I agree. And I think what's the metaphor about attaching the wing on the plane as you're flying it? That little story. That's what we're doing, right? I mean, we are doing that. So we are trying to figure it out as we fly the plane. So I think you're right.
But I think that I just want to push back on that a little bit, and I recognize that it's true. But the challenge is when people are creating laws and don't understand the problem holistically, then your laws aren't necessarily as good as they could be. So there's a real lack of understanding about the lived experience on campus day to day. So for example, creating legislation that requires victims to make a police report, that is harmful. It's not helpful. It's not helpful for the victims. It makes it difficult for the universities, and eventually people don't come forward and report. I think the intentionality behind that is good, but the real lived experience is that's bad legislation. That is bad for victims. That's bad for students. That's bad for institutions. So if there's a way for us to remain committed to this and further this process, but slow down the train in some ways to say, let's gather information. Let's really understand these things before we just write something that ends up being something that people don't understand. On campuses on a day-to-day basis, faculty are shrilling about this idea of being responsible employees and what that means. And so that's very difficult to implement. That's very difficult for folks to understand. How do I engage in my class in a discussion, and then if someone writes in their journal or they want to come and talk to me and they're going to say anything about sexual assault, I put up my hands and say, don't tell me, because if you tell me, then I have to do these things. So well-intended, but in the lived experience, not so great.
Which means there is a need. This report strikes the need that we have to sync up our relationships between our state campuses in particular and our state policymakers in a better way. Because on this issue, we're here.
Yes.
Everybody watches all the TV shows about courtroom dramas, and we think that that's how it should go on a campus. Yeah. And the philosophy, as we all know, is completely different. So your issue about role of counsel and role of police and that kind of thing is very challenging. I mean, look at some of the state courts now that are overturned. This is overturning judicial hearings because the attorney did not have the right to cross-examine the witness. And things like that.
We're not a court of law.
That's
We're
opening
an
up a
educational
whole
institution.
change in the way that we have historically, in the last 20 years, managed our judicial processes on campus. And I think some of that is maybe, it's grandstanding, but some of it's just a lack of understanding, and we're just not communicating in the ways that would help that and message that in some ways. And maybe we would still have some negative outcomes, but I think we needed a better job of finding those connections and helping each other understand what our processes are, what the philosophies are, because we all know here in this room and most of our audience out there that we're not trying to replicate a court of law, but that sometimes is the framework that gets put on from some of our policy levels, both at the federal and state level.
Yeah, well, so you brought up the word implementation, right? And I want to spend a little bit of time in that space and particularly come back to something that I think is pretty exciting that Will mentioned about sort of creating a crosswalk at the state level to get an understanding of what's happening, and what's required of institutions on this issue at a federal level, where may or may not state action be helpful to fill a void, or would it be duplicative, and then what's happening at the campus level. So Will, if you could talk a little bit more about that process, that would be really helpful. And then I want to get to, sort of where are we seeing some implementation successes potentially here, even if we're still struggling to gather conclusive evidence on that. So Will, could you talk about that project a little bit more, because I think it's something that people are interested in.
Well, it was, fairly large effort on behalf of staff at the Pennsylvania Department of Education and the Governor's Policy Office to look at, using the tools that you guys have provided to look at what's happening in every other state, to examine what we currently have and what legislation currently exists in Pennsylvania, what's been proposed in Pennsylvania, what are the requirements at a federal level regarding Title IX and Clery, and then how or where are the gaps in what we're currently doing. And so we put that together, and that's some of the information that we're going to be sharing at our roundtable discussion, so that as we enter that room, people understand where we're at now, what currently exists on the federal and the state level, and then if there are these gaps, how do we begin to address or have a conversation about that so that we can have comprehensive policy that protects students. And so the process has been long and arduous. An example, for example, in Pennsylvania, we currently have legislation. We have the Sexual Violence Education Act that was passed in 2010 in Pennsylvania, and so that was one of the pieces of legislation that we looked at in Pennsylvania, and we've seen that many of the requirements are similar to the new primary prevention requirements in Clery. So we're taking a hard look at that, and we're saying, we're trying to distinguish, and this is, I think, what we're trying to do specifically in Pennsylvania, between requirements and enforcement. So what we don't want campuses to do, and I think this is one of the challenges in the policy arena, is that as we think about creating policy in Pennsylvania, or we create policy, we're thinking about not only large state residential institutions, but there's over 183 institutions in Pennsylvania, and then there's for-profit institutions. And so as you look at a very complex higher education landscape, how do you create policy and legislation that's enforceable across all of those different types of campuses? And so, we're taking a look at, like I said, we're taking a look at not only what we currently have, but how are we enforcing legislation that we currently have? So is it simply checking a box, or are there monitoring requirements? And so how can we more effectively implement what we currently have? And so, the crosswalk has been really helpful in providing, I think, a framework for us to think about what currently is occurring at a state, federal, at national level.
That's great. No, I mean, I think that that's the kind of resources that hopefully this partnership can also continue to elevate and provide as a model to other folks, because certainly the good work that's going on there in Pennsylvania. So I want to get back to this question about, we might not have conclusive evidence, we don't know, but, we got to do something. And just like there's pressure in the policy community to take some action, that probably no action is not an option. It's the same in the lived experience of campus administrators and college presidents as well. So what are some of the things people are trying that we're at least hopeful about? Maybe Kevin, you can start, that you've seen that are working to address this.
So we know a lot about what works. One thing what works is how we approach the problem at the campus level. And what works is looking at this as a complex, holistic issue, which requires then many stakeholders at the campus to come together to address both individual incidents as well as large policy conversations. So, I mean, the Office of Violence Against Women has been looking at these coordinated campus response teams as an example. And I want to point out the cultural respect model, which is now associated with NASPA. That model really talks about pulling together a leadership team and looking at policies, victim support, conduct, education, prevention in a holistic way. And that, I think, that's in our gut. We know that works. I know Allie is working right now. We have 12 pilot institutions where we're actually kind of digging into that to study how that works, and so that we can then roll out this cultural respect model more nationally. But probably within the next 6 months or so, Allie, I think we'll have some pretty good data about how that process is working. So I think that's one example. I think we have to look at this, when a campus looks at this, Felicia would echo this, has to be coordinated across the entire campus. You need multiple stakeholders, both to respond to the individual victim and also to respond holistically to the problem that exists on campus. So that's one thing every campus should be doing today. If you don't have one in place, you should be actively trying to find that community-based, coalition of folks at the campus level to address this and to look at it proactively going forward.
I would add to that that we need to have campus conversations on this topic openly, publicly, and with all campus constituent groups. Because Kevin is right. One of the perceptions about higher education is that many institutions value their reputation over the needs of their students, and so we're hiding something. And so our approach has been to engage our campus community in these conversations and to talk about this and to talk about the fact that it's not acceptable and we need to change the climate. And the climate won't change because we write a new student conduct policy or a policy on sexual violence. The climate will change when all members of our campus understand and start to reflect back what is and isn't acceptable, and that they challenge one another on their behaviors, right? So we're engaging students in that process, we're engaging our staff and faculty in that process, and our university leaders, and being vocal about the issue and discussing it. We're also engaged in many educational initiatives around bystander intervention, and we know that that has worked for us, and beginning to engage students in this whole campus climate shift. So where campuses and others are engaged in It's On Us or the No More campaign, all those things are ways that students can engage, as well as making this really part of the university experience. So we have clubs and organizations that are doing programming around it as well. We're bringing in speakers who are talking about this, because it's challenging for me at my age and who I am to talk with students about their sex life. They really don't want to talk with me about that. I don't know why. Really, I don't want to talk to them about it, but it's mutual. But they want to talk to each other, and we know that students are. In our survey, we learned that almost 80% of our students who would report if something happened to them are going to share that with another student. That's the first place they're going to go. So students are our biggest resource in changing the climate. And so we're trying to educate them, equip them with information as well. So we're doing that through education, outreach, making them part of the conversation, and trying to, in a way, begin to demystify this. And so as much as it makes people my age want to blush, we have to engage in these conversations with students.
Well, and I think one of the things that we have to communicate the outcomes of those conversations back into the policy space
Absolutely.
is, in fact, as we're more transparent and open and welcoming about those, we may in fact uncover that we have a problem that shows a significant rise in intensity because people feel comfortable doing
Correct.
it. And I think feeding that information back into people like Will and the
Yes.
legislators he's working with, that campus climate surveys, the goal is not to have zero.
No.
And in fact, you're going to have more
We
reports. So I
want
wanna-
more people to
I want
report.
Will to jump in on
And
that.
I wanted to quickly say something about that, because that's, as we talk about, our campuses trying to hide something, while we don't believe that, when we look at clear reporting numbers and we see the number of zeros reported, I mean, it is problematic for me personally to think that a campus that, 78%, I think is what it is in Pennsylvania, reported zero. To me, that's problematic. How do we have this many institutions report zero? And so is it an issue of reporting, and then how do we ease reporting? And so that's a conversation we've been having. And so when we think about the metrics, baseline data, and we're looking at this in Pennsylvania, so if we have this many institutions reporting zero now, and we start a statewide initiative to encourage bystander intervention and reporting goes up, in my opinion, that's a victory, but we have to make sure that that gets communicated across the board, that everyone understands that we've created an environment where students are more comfortable reporting, not that all of a sudden there's more issues because we started this and now it's
Correct.
occurring at a greater rate, that the number has gone up, and that's actually a good thing, because now we created environments that are safe for reporting. So it's not that, at a state level that we believe that institutions are trying to hide something, but when we look at the Clery data, it looks like institutions are trying to hide something.
And I think that's fair. I think that's very fair. And when nobody's reporting, to me what that says is students don't know how to report, where to report. So there is a problem, absolutely. The other thing that I would add is this conversation needs to be elevated to not just be around sexual assault. What we're seeing, at least on my campus, are more issues of relationship and dating violence. And that is a very real issue. That can potentially be life-threatening. So that is, for me, the next iteration of this work, because of what we're seeing and the number of reports. We are getting more reports, and that's a good thing. I don't believe that our numbers are necessarily inflated. I think now people know that this is not acceptable. They know how to report, and they're reporting. We want to see that, but we're also seeing more of those cases be about dating and relationship violence. So that's informing our work for the future. The other thing that I failed to mention earlier in terms of campus initiatives is bringing everyone into the conversation. this issue cannot be seen as a women's issue. It needs to be seen as a campus issue, a societal issue that needs to be addressed. So we're doing a lot of work around engaging men in this, and so we've hired a coordinator of men's engagement, and we're working on some men and masculinity issues, because that's also a big part of the problem. So we can't just focus on, is there support for survivors? How does the reporting process work? Is the conduct process fair? We also need to look at what is really happening on our campus, and how we're going to prevent it is to begin to do that work early on, and also to look at legislation that happens in the elementary and high schools as well.
I would, Felicia, as you mentioned, it's not just a women's issue, and I think the other area I think that where many campuses are exploring also is looking at issues of gender identity and expression as well. And I want to kind of applaud New York State and their legislation, because they name gender identity and expression in their legislation around sexual assault. And the experiences of our LGBT students need to be included. I know, but need to be included in this conversation. And sometimes we sort of think about it in one dimension.
Agreed.
But I think many campuses are thinking, understanding the impact of this on our GLBT community, and I think that's a great example of New York. And in New York, where I had some other problems with their legislation, but that was a place where, hooray, we need to get that more commonly acknowledged as a part of the dimension of the problem.
And to add to that, LGBT students have higher rates of victimization.
That's right.
So we have to work and focus on that population.
You know, kind of hitting on one of the other things that you said was the importance of this in the K-12 space, and so that's something that we're examining in Pennsylvania, because students often arrive at campus and they've been victimized, and they're re-victimized on campuses.
Yes.
And so including them, I think there's a really good curriculum being developed in California for middle schools. And so I think looking at how do we begin to address these issues at the middle school, high school level, and then how do we engage parents in having conversation with their own children. So I have a 12-year-old son. How do I engage in this dialogue with him about respect and affirmative consent and all of these issues that we're facing here? So I think that looking at it from a broader from that perspective, we can't only think of this as a K-12 issue, or as a university and college issue. It's a K-12 issue as well that we need to really put on the map and begin to think about more broadly.
Well, I think that last point, this issue is now fitting into a more common framing of higher ed policy writ large, right? Which is this is the same words we use to talk about college readiness. Right. As an example, it's no longer okay for the university to just turn around and point at the high schools and say, well, if you would just get it better, that they have to be part of that. So I think that that's great. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. I should say, as you can tell, there's a lot of passion and energy from the panelists. If you have questions for people that are here in the audience, please just let me know. We can get that question introduced. I want to pick up a couple that have come in, and one in particular around the relationship between sort of campus police and then local police jurisdictions. We touched on that in the report. It was one of the things we looked at. We know that, again, depending upon the environment in which the institution is located, whether that's a rural environment, whether that's an urban center like Rutgers is, these are complex relationships, and they're ones that I think, for the most part, state policy has done a good job of saying, we want something to exist, but exactly what that's going to look like is going to vary. Could you talk a little bit about, at least in Rutgers' case, what that partnership or relationship is like, and maybe what it could or should be, in your opinion,
Thank you.
larger perspective?
I believe we're particularly lucky at Rutgers because we have a solid partnership, and it's necessary because the role of the police is inextricably connected in some ways to this work. Victims have a choice. They get to choose whether or not they go forward, but they should have a person from law enforcement help explain their options to them. And so I think we need to, we have been fortunate to have a very solid partnership where law enforcement will contact us if they receive any reports. We can have conversations with them if we receive reports so that we work out the Cleary piece, but still allow the victim to be in the driver's seat in terms of what he or she wants to do. And so I think when you have law enforcement that are trained in this area and understand their responsibilities around sex crimes, but also understand a little bit about student development and about our work, because there's a real intersection. And students want a seamless process, right? And so they don't want us to go into our whole compliance thing about this is who I report to and this is what I have to do. They just need support.
Yeah.
And so we're in a positive position because we have a good relationship with our police department, and they work very well with us. And you know, it can be clumsy if you don't have that, but we want the victims to be the driver in that process, and we've been able to work with a police force that respects that and will kind of partner with us. And it is important to share information on both sides, because they on our campus they have that obligation around collecting the numbers for Clery, and so we need to provide them information. They need to provide us information, and our entire goal should be to support the student who's had something really bad happen to them and not have processes that re-victimize them.
Willa, just one question, if you can speak to this at all about this relationship piece, or at least the feedback you've been received from some of the presidents that have been involved in the initiative, particularly in the rural communities and spaces. I know a lot of the talk around supporting students and providing that infrastructure is around engagement with community partners. But one of the things we know is that not all communities have partners there that institutions can work with. Have you received any sort of feedback, or is this an issue that you've been thinking about in your work, about how we can help?
Well, I think that's one of the things we're considering in this work. We have engaged in a number of different, I would consider, different types of campuses. So, for example, all 14 of the community colleges in Pennsylvania have signed on. Yeah. And so the resources and the challenges that community college face are significantly different than a residential college. And so it's trying to make campuses aware of the local resources and state resources that are available to them. And we do that by, for example, in the upcoming event in Pittsburgh, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. We have other partners who will be joining us at the table to provide information on the resources and the services that are available. Campuses may not be able to provide the comprehensive wraparound services that exist out of Rutgers, and so how do we engage in partnership and collaboration with these experts at the state and local level to make sure that students are getting the resources they need and the support that they need as they experience as they go through these experiences.
That's well great. I appreciate it. Yeah, Allison, please.
Hi, Dr. McGinty or others on the panel could answer as well, but I'm wondering particularly around climate surveys, because that's a hot topic, and I think it's great data that you get as well. But on the legislative side, we're seeing kind of state and federal legislation looking at mandating climate surveys and possibly standardizing them. And my question to you would be, I'm sure you clearly had the resources of having a team put one together for your institution. Do you think that may have changed if it were standardized? Do you see, because I can tell you from where we sit, the data would be great to get, but I think the challenge there, if it's standardized, is it going to ask the questions that you need to ask on your campus?
Correct. So just to clarify, we were asked to pilot the survey from the White House, and it was predicated on the work of Vicki Banyard, who's great. And so we were able to take that and modify it, tweak it a little bit, and I think that it would be very important for campuses to have some leeway to modify any instrument to make it work for them, because otherwise, garbage in, garbage out. You have to ask the right questions that are relevant to your campus community. So I think always having the leeway there is important, and I also think that there are, so I'm not a fan of something that is a cookie cutter, one size fits all. I think that there are some basic questions that we need to ask about victimization, and there's a way that you can do that by selecting questions that have been validated, and so I look at the work of Vicki Banyard, and I think it's great. I know the ARC3 group is looking at creating a bank of surveys that institutions could pull from. And what I like about that particular project is you can choose modules. So now that we've done our initial campus climate survey, we've learned some things, and now we also have had a year with this, and we're seeing more issues around dating and relationship violence. So in our next iteration of the campus climate survey, I want to ask more pointed questions about that because that's an issue for us and we want to learn more about it. I also have had an opportunity to do some lobby visits on the Hill and to visit with a number of folks, including Senator McCaskill's office. And what I shared with them is be mindful that if you create a survey and mandate that colleges or universities have to do it every year or every 2 years, that's too much. It doesn't allow us time to actually do something with the data that we've learned. And if you come up with a mandate like that, then this will simply be relegated to checking a box. Every year I have to do your little silly survey and I'll do it and it doesn't mean anything. And campuses will focus more on doing the survey than they will on creating the interventions and programs that are needed to better support students. So my feedback to them was that they needed to give us time and that the life cycle at a college or university for students is, every 3 to 4 years. So every 3 to 4 years it would be helpful for us, but it would not be helpful for us to have to do a survey every year. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to do it well, and our students are also survey fatigued. We're surveying them all the time, so they won't take it seriously if it's something that we do every year.
No, that's great. I really appreciate the comments. And the question, Allison, I think is a good one, and it gets to this notion about sort of the intersectionality of the compliance environments that we're wrestling with. There's another question that's come in the audience, and I think it came in through our virtual questions that I'm getting here. But are there things that we can learn from what's happened in K-12 space for anybody that wants to speak to this? Are there things that are happening in K-12 space about reporting and about these kind of conversations and creating an open environment that we could learn from in the higher education community? I think that was a question that we had that came in here. So, Will, I don't know, in the partnership when you're working with superintendents, how are they getting this information that we're talking about? Obviously not through.
In our experience, the superintendents are looking to higher education to help guide some of these conversations. I think that this is an issue that in the K-12 spaces, we talk to superintendents and they meet up with, we have these opportunities to engage with college presidents. They're really drawing on that resource. This is a relatively new conversation, I think, in the K-12 space in terms of, dealing with trying to address this issue and then providing the services and supports. The mandated reporting is one thing, but trying to address, this issue at a statewide or at a school level, I think is something that's very different, and it falls aligned with all the other requirements that schools have around testing and around federal and state requirements for schooling, and then on top of that you have this issue. And so we've in our roundtables we've had several opportunities for superintendents to talk about the experience of having a young lady who was waiting for the bus and get assaulted, and then meeting with that mother and being at a loss for words, and how do you address that mother and safety, and then talking about now I'm worried about every kid who's waiting for the bus. And so I think that they're looking to higher education to help guide some of this conversation and provide access to resources and to information. And so in our experience in Pennsylvania, it's been really the higher ed that are providing some of the resources back to the K-12 space.
That's good. Well, certainly I think that what we can learn from that example is the necessity of partnerships, and that's where we started, trying to bring people together. And it's where we started trying to bring together organizations like Education Commission States and NASPA to do this work. So on a final question, I'll put everybody on the spot. If you have sort of one thing, if you're in the campus practitioner position, or in Kevin's case representing institutions, if there's one thing you could tell a policy audience about this topic, either something you'd like to see them do or potentially see them not do, what might that be? And then for Will, I'll flip it around. If you could get a piece of information about this issue, this afternoon from a campus perspective that would help the work you're doing in Pennsylvania, what might that be? So we'll start with Kevin. It's always fun to put you on the spot first.
Yeah, I think I would go back to some of the things I said right from the beginning. For folks at the state policy area, I would say of course they do understand that the complexity of higher education in their states, but that one-size-fits-all kind of mandates are going to be very challenging given the complexity of higher education at the state level. And the second thing is there's a little thread of a morale issue here I want to just comment on. And the morale issue is This is really hard work at the front lines, and Felicia will tell you that. I've talked to vice presidents who say, they have heard things and been immersed in things about the behavior of students that is just so shocking and so disturbing that they want to go home and shower. And then at the front line, the people who are serving victims advocate roles and are working at the prevention, these people care so deeply about this. So I want to communicate the passion we have for trying to make this right and to improve the health and safety of all of our students, and to change that kind of narrative and to be partners in that process and to understand what college and university are really digging in and trying to address a very, very complex societal issue.
Yes.
That's what I want to have.
Very clear. Go ahead.
From a state policy perspective, I think the issue of data is important. So having that data, and I know that there's an aversion or concern about any type of mandated survey, but that type of information is really helpful on a policy perspective to help frame the broader conversation. And so I think reliable data is always helpful from a state policy perspective to help us to frame the information. And then evidence-based approaches. And so I think if we had more people doing research on this area, when you look at national research in this area, there's, it's not very deep. And so I think having some evidence-based approaches, research on this, actionable research or research that shows what works or doesn't work would be helpful from a state policy perspective. So there are two things that I could ask for. I think it would be more data and evidence-based approach. More people doing research on this area.
Thanks, Will. Felicia?
I would ask policymakers to recognize that we're dealing with young people, for the most part, who have grown up in a world that's always included the internet, and that have had lots of exposure, and because of that have had lots of exposure to sex and formed lots of ideas about that before they come to a university campus. And so it is very difficult for us to take in one night and unlearn 18 years of behaviors the first night you move on campus. And that's really what we're dealing with. This begins the first night students move on campus. So that's kind of the landscape of the challenge that we have, and I think it's important for them to understand that. And my hope would be that in whatever they do in terms of legislation, that they could clarify consent, especially affirmative consent, that they could clarify the role of responsible employees, and help us understand ways to train and support faculty and staff, that they could clarify the role of prevention with a focus on bystander intervention, and then consider policies for elementary and high schools, K-12 education.
It's one big, long sentence.
Yes,
That's good.
a run-on.
Let me just, and please ask the audience here to thank our panelists for their contributions. Obviously a really important topic and important discussion to continue, and I think hopefully what we've done today a little bit through this panel is model some of the conversations and behaviors we're hoping to see at the policy level and at the institution level about this. I want to thank everybody who participated in the webinar virtually, and certainly those of you here in the audience. And I want to give a little plug to one additional output or area of consideration that the Education Commission of the States and NASPA have worked in partnership on. In addition to campus sexual violence policy, we've been working on tracking and writing about what states are doing with guns on campus and conceal and carry work. And so we had a report that was released in January about that. We'll continue to track and update folks on what's happening on that legislative front as we move forward. But thank you again, everybody, to joining us here today, and we look forward to keeping all this work moving forward.
Yeah, I want to.